Well, we're excited for you, Micki. Micki is the Dorothy Bray Endowed Professor in the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College and a Foundation Professor at Arizona State University. Her research focuses on learning, especially for STEM domains. She currently has 3 strands of funded work applicable to both pre-college and college-level instruction in STEM. The first strand is a theory of active learning or engagement called ICAP. You'll hear more about that. The second strand is a theory about emergent causality that explains the robustness of many science misconceptions across domains. The third strand is her discovery of a new paradigm for learning, from online videos that overcome the limitation of active learning practices in online learning contexts. Just to highlight a few of her accomplishments, she told me to keep it brief. I will. We want to hear from her. She went from assistant to associate to full in 8 years, from 1982 to 1990, in the Department of Psychology at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Chi's work is widely cited and has great impact. Currently, her work has been cited over 43,000 times, according to Google Scholar. Her 1981 paper, published in Cognitive Science, on expert novice differences in problem representation, was recognized as a citation classic in 1993, only 12 years after its publication. Besides making theoretical contributions and uncovering new learning paradigms, she also makes methodological contributions. Her 1997 coding paper, in which she introduced a new way of quantifying qualitative data, was noted by the journal's editor as one of the journal's most cited papers on methodology. Her work also makes impact in other related fields. A 2013 paper with her PhD student, Masin Menexi, received the William Elgin Wickenden Award from the Society for Engineering Education. And the 1992 paper with Jay Bedard on expertise was noted by the journal Auditing, a journal of practice and theory, as one of its most frequently cited authors. Her 2005 paper on common sense conceptions of emergent processes, why some misconceptions are robust, was listed as the most cited paper on science education in the Web of Science database under the subcategory Students Thinking About Science. And then finally, she's received many recognitions and awards throughout her career, including an invited resident fellow in 1996-97 at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, one of the 7 inaugural fellows elected to the Cognitive Science Society in 2013, received 2 awards from AERA, the Sylvia Scribner Award in 2013, and the Distinguished Contributions to Research and Education Award in 2016, for which she's giving a talk today. Being an interdisciplinary scholar, she also received an award from the American Psychological Association, the E.L. Thorndike Career Achievement Award in 2015, elected to the National Academy of Education in 2010, and most recently in 2016 was inducted into the oldest and most prestigious honorary societies, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. We're excited for you. We're honored to be here, Micki. Congratulations, and please.
It's an honor to be recipient of this award, and I thank Rodney and his committee a lot for choosing me, I guess. And I'm going to share with you the talk today, and with the luxury of an hour and a half, actually, I hope I can talk slower, because you know how fast I talk sometimes. I think you can wander off. Okay. Okay, now you can hear me, right? Wait. So I'm going to talk about a project that's taken us quite a long time. You'll see that it's taken us 5+ years on translating ICAP, which is a theory about ways students can engage to promote deeper understanding. So I'm going to start by quickly explaining, I shouldn't say quickly, but quickly explaining the terms engage and deeper learning in a broad way, just in broad terms. So I'll first of all, focus on cognitive engagement, and there's many other kinds that people talk about, motivation and emotional engagement and so forth, in the context of a classroom. That is, when students come into the classroom to learn, how is the student engaging? So cognitive engagement, however, is not well defined, as Gary Sinatra pointed out and Barbara Green. And in this classroom context, a broad definition that we like to use is just think of engagement as what students do with instruction or instructional materials. I use those two synonymously. Or similar to Skinner and Belmont's definition is the quality of students' participation with learning activities in the classroom. So these are just broad definition. Measurements of engagement have typically been students' self-report, survey questions of effort and strategies, observations and interviews, and more recently, a call for analysis of student products, and Barbara Green made such a call. We proposed a new metric that includes product analysis. So by deeper learning here, I just mean how successfully can students answer more difficult questions. So I'm not referring to the underlying cognitive processes, just how well they can answer questions. So this is over a 5-year translation project, and we take sort of an iterative approach. I know there are many other approaches, but this is the approach we're taking. First, we identify an authentic learning problem in the classroom. For example, students are not engaging with learning. And then we sort of try to explain why that might be in the laboratory. Let's say we propose a theory-driven and evidence-based explanation or hypothesis of how they actually engage. And then we collect evidence to see whether our explanation is first supported or not. Then we start to translate into practice, and this is the first effort that I've tried. And then we design intervention, and then we actually implement it in the classroom. And what we want to assess is both teachers' learning and students' learning. So the goal of this research is threefold. First, we want to define cognitive engagement in classroom settings in a simple operational way without compounding it with motivation and emotion. Secondly, we don't want to rely on students' self-report. And third, we want to be able to detect engagement while learning, not report reflection in a survey after class. Or as Barbara Green stated, the goal of measuring engagement is to be able to study what students do when they're naturally engaged in learning. The second goal is, can we actually teach teachers how to promote and elicit greater cognitive engagement from students? And third, does promoting students to be more engaged actually cost them to achieve deeper understanding? So the outline of the talk is first, we're going to go over the ICAP theory briefly, well, maybe not so briefly, but go over it and how it's based on students' engagement. Then we're going to do a quick overview, this part is hopefully quick, about the evidence that support ICAP's predictions. And then finally, we're going to talk about our attempt at translating ICAP into practice. That is, we've developed a PD kind of intervention and what kind of teacher learning and student learning that we were able to measure as outcomes. Okay, teachers and lay people are great at identifying off-task or disengaged behavior. So the Goldberg paper, for example, they talk about disengagement. That's actually off-task behavior. So off-task or disengaged behavior and on-task, which is engaged behaviors, are often conceived of as binary, that is, you're either disengaged or you're engaged. Using participant in activities or doing something with instruction as our general definition of what on-task behavior can be, then all four of these classroom behaviors that we depicted can be considered engaging behavior. For example, you could be paying attention, you could be measuring, you could be drawing a concept map, or you could be comparing ideas and justifying. These are all on-task behavior. So what we're really proposing is that these four groups of activities represent distinct or differentiable modes of overt behaviors and products. That is, these four differentiable modes correspond to four incremental levels of student learning. That's really the basis for our hypothesis. So our claim mainly is that students' overt behaviors can be discriminated, and their overt behaviors, along with their products, can serve as a gross indicator of how they're engaged cognitively. So let me clarify. We're not talking about behavior engagement, which typically measures persistence, effort, resilience, purposefulness, and seeking out information. Like there's another definition of behavior engagement. We're really talking about cognitive engagement expressed by behaviors. So the next few slides, what I'm going to show you is the behavior of each mode. in terms of what the students do, along with the products they might have produced, and the content processes corresponding to each mode. So, the first mode is attending behavior, which we call the passive mode. So in this mode, students are actually paying attention, they're oriented toward instruction, and they're receiving instruction. But they're not doing anything else overtly or producing anything. So examples are listening to a lecture, watching a video, observing a demonstration, and reading a book, and not doing much else. The second is manipulating behavior, which we call the active mode. That is, students are paying attention and physically manipulating the instructional materials, but not adding any new information. So some examples are they're copying the solution from the board, in which case the product is some identical steps. They're underlying the important sentences, which means the text is marked up with a subset of the sentences that they underline, agreeing on dialogue, so yeah, selecting an option, describing a scene, recording an amount, pointing and gesturing, and repeating. And so you can see the kind of products they might produce. The basic idea is that the products that they produce are contained and identified components within the instructional materials. That's a definition. It's very operational. We take it literally. Okay, generating behavior is a constructive mode in which students are producing some additional information that may contain either incidentally or accidentally produced small pieces of knowledge that is new to yourself and to the instructional materials. So we're not talking about people, inventing the new principle, Newton's principle or anything. We're just talking about the ability to add a tiny little piece of information. And as in the self-explanation work show, cumulatively, a lot of these tiny little inferences really help you learn. So some examples are drawing a concept map or diagram. And so the output is your diagram. If you're explaining, the output is your explanations. If you're posting, the output is your question. If you're taking notes, the output is your notes. So, and if you're doing comparing and contrasting, for example, the output is similarities and differences. So you can see that the similarity differences that you generate were not in the instructional materials. That's how we can tell you've generated it. And this includes monitoring, which is look at having some understanding, insights of your own understanding, that you're comparing what you know and what's out there. Collaborating behavior, on the other hand, is the interactive mode. It's a little bit different than the other ones in that you're actually working with a peer, and we look mostly at exchanges and dialogue. So talking, taking turns, sharing attention, meaning that each person is generating and building on the other person's contribution in a mutually co-generative or co-constructive way. That's our definition of interactive. Sometimes people in the past have referred to this as transactive dialogues. So one example is if you're explaining jointly, your outputs could be a richer explanation. If you're debating with a peer, the output could be a better formulated argument, and so forth. So the summary of the 4 different behavior modes of cognitive engagement are, as we note, attending, manipulating, generating, collaborating, which down the bottom, which is sometimes we'll call it passive, active, constructive, interactive. And the description is what the behavior mainly are, and the outputs are what kind of stuff they produce. Okay, that's just a summary slide. I think that part's pretty clear. Okay, what are the advantages of focusing on behaviors as an indicator of cognitive engagement? Well, first of all, behaviors are overt, which means teachers can observe such behaviors in the classrooms, right? Can observe it more directly. Teachers don't have to infer what cognitive processes you're doing and or thinking. Secondly, overt behaviors can provide immediacy. That is, you don't have to wait for the cell reports after class. So teachers may be able to provide feedback. Behaviors are malleable so that teachers can actually elicit them. So these are the reasons why we're using behaviors. So what cognitive processes might correspond to these 4 behavior modes? I think it's pretty safe to assume that learning is typically conceived of as taking in information, or what psychologists call encoding instructional information, and then changing your knowledge using what I call knowledge change processes. Okay, anything in quotes means words I'm making up and I will define. So assuming knowledge can be represented as a node-link structure, that's a pretty common assumption, we can speculate what cognitive processes occur with each behavioral mode based on 4 simple elementary knowledge change processes. I mean, there are many other elementary processes too, but suppose we just take these 4: store, link, activate, infer from your own prior knowledge, or infer from others' knowledge. So the next 4 slides, I'm going to just speculate what this might look like. Oh, wait. I already said that. Okay, so suppose you're paying attention, and that what you're doing is you're reading this text, but you're only reading, you're not taking notes or anything else. So basically what you're doing is you're storing this new information in ends, right? And you could be storing it in an isolated way, what's White called in 1927 inert knowledge. We're going to call it encapsulated knowledge. Other people have called it that too. So the performance outcome of encapsulated knowledge is that it's good for immediate recall and recall in the same context and so forth. Next is manipulating behavior. Suppose you're reading and you're highlighting some of the text. What happens when you highlight some text is the parts that you highlight probably cause that knowledge to be activated in memory, right? And once that knowledge is activated in memory, you could be linking new knowledge with it. So what happens with the outcome of your knowledge is that your knowledge is actually embedded or assimilated, and it's more complete and strengthened because you're activated and so on. So performance outcome could be you learn the knowledge, what you've learned can be more easily retrieved, and your understanding what was presented may be more complete. So being active is pretty powerful already. If you're in the generative or constructive mode, what you're doing is you're reading and maybe underlining, but you're definitely taking notes as well. So taking notes means you're focused on some aspects of the text that you want to take notes in, thus activating relevant prior knowledge, linking with prior knowledge. But in addition, taking non-verbatim notes that it may cause you to make inferences about some new knowledge. Suppose you just made an inference and linking this new knowledge with O. So if these inferences are actually expressed in your external notes, they can be identified as information not provided in instructional materials. So you can see already that how we can identify when they've made inferences in the outputs. So the knowledge outcome is more elaborated knowledge, not just more complete. The performance outcome could be more understanding, perhaps deeper understanding in a way they can transfer your knowledge. Finally, the most difficult, interesting one to talk about is collaborative or constructive type of interaction. Here, a partner must build on each other's contribution. That is, they must infer from their own and infer from the other's contribution. So you're taking note, you're reading, taking notes, and then you're discussing with a peer. So let's see what happens. So Romy could be making an inference about X and utter something about X, and then Juno could be incorporating, assimilating X, and then X plus Y in Juno can generate Y, right? And then you could articulate Y. This makes me think about Y. And then Romy can then assimilate Y and generate Z. So what you see in this little depiction is that the knowledge outcome is extended. That's just a word I'm using. It means that new knowledge that neither partner could create, such as Y and Z, could be created when you collaborate. So the performance outcome is potentially you can innovate new ideas. What's the impact of these 4 modes of engagement behavior? Well, based on the processes we just described, the knowledge change outcomes for the 4 modes, as I said, are the 4 E's: encapsulated, embedded, elaborate, extended. So this leads us to make a prediction about the incremental levels of learning based on the outcome of the knowledge that I just talked about. So the hypothesis is that I is better than C, better than A, and better than P for across the 4 modes. And there's a corollary to this hypothesis, which is that I and C are probably more similar, which is much greater than A and P, mainly because only the constructive and interactive modes have the infer process in it. Sometimes you can think about these 2 as deeper processing on top and shallower processing on the bottom. The one thing I want to note is that the prediction that we're making of the learning levels are relative. That is, relatively, one mode is better than the other. Relatively, one set of processes is different from the other. We're not making absolute evaluation here or specification. Okay, one counterintuitive finding or analysis that falls out of this analysis is that the prediction our prediction is that paying attention is the lowest form of engagement. Notice that paying attention is something that a lot of researchers try to get students to do, either in an automated system or in a classroom. But this is actually the lowest form, so it cannot enhance deep learning. So I have 4 caveats, so to clarify this theory a little bit. First is that the correspondence between overt behaviors and the cognitive knowledge change process are clearly not 100%, right? Because we can't look at the cognitive processes, but it's more likely. But just because it's more likely, that means on average, our prediction is confirmed. So it's more likely within a person and more likely within a classroom. So on average, the prediction is confirmed. Secondly, sometimes overt behavior could indicate 1 or 2 modes, right? If you're taking notes, you could be taking notes, just copying notes, or you could take notes that actually have some new ideas in there. So for those occasions, we actually have to analyze the products, the notes, to know. So in this case, what we circle in red are the extra information. So we're very literal. We literally compare the products with what we presented. Caveats 3 and 4 is a little bit related. That is, one point is that not all domains require the 2 higher modes of deeper processing. For example, if you're learning rules of grammar, you don't need the 2 higher modes because there's nothing you can infer or justify. You just have to know these are the rules. You add as when, in English. And we cannot detect the 4th one, performance benefits of these 2 higher modes, that is the constructive interactive mode, unless the assessment questions include deeper questions. This is a very important point that we didn't say emphasize enough. Okay, let's summarize the theory part. This theory is already published, so I'm going to summarize it quickly and go and spend most of my time in the last third. So we've operationally defined a taxonomy of cognitive engagement based on students' overt behaviors along with the outputs. And in this taxonomy is universal and that is applicable to all topics, all age groups, and all activities. We generate a hypothesis that predicts the relative levels of learning in this decremental order I over C over A equal P, and a corollary that there's greater similarities between the top 2 modes and less similarities of the lower 2 modes, but a greater gap between the 2. Okay, here's one key point that we made theoretically, and we'll see that it doesn't happen in practice. So one initial assumption is that this assumption underlying the whole point initially is that for the same instruction, let's say lecturing, students can engage in multiple ways. So the level of learning depends on the mode that students engage. That's still true, but we'll see what limitations are. Let me show you in this because I want to emphasize this key point. So the point is on the left, if a teacher explains and works out a problem on the whiteboard, a student can do any one of these 4 things, right? They could listen to the teacher, copy down the solution step, justify the solution step, and work with a peer. So as you go up on the 4 modes, they will learn more. So that's the idea. We'll see what the problem is later. Okay, I'm transitioning to the second part of the talk, which is providing the evidence. So there's lots of evidence supporting ICAP predictions. That's not our data, but other people's data. I'm going to just go over quickly 4, because there's really lots and lots of evidence out there. The first one is a recent meta-analysis reviewing 225 STEM college classrooms. And this is done all in, of course, science classes, and this was a meta-analysis. And what basically shows is that if you lecture, students learn almost half a standard deviation more than if you did not lecture. So we infer that if you don't lecture, like in a flipped classroom, then students are either active, constructive, or interactive. So broadly, this supports the ICAP hypothesis. Next is what we've done, which is there's hundreds of studies out there in the literature that we can reinterpret to see whether it's compatible or consistent with ICAP. And I'll just show you one study in that case. And what we do is we take pairwise comparison of the modes, see whether the relative comparisons is true, and I'll show you a new study. And the third one is numerous classroom comparisons, and classroom comparisons is a little harder. It's easy in some sense because they have multiple intervention, multiple modes, and that's easy to decide too. And then finally, a lab study we did ourselves. So as I said, there's over 100 lab studies, and this is just picked from countersign, learning science, education literatures. And what we do, reinterpret the conditions of intervention if we can cleanly map it to an ICAP mode. If we can't cleanly map it, then I just won't look at it. So we want to fill out the cell, right? So the cell makes prediction. For example, the second one, active is better than passive, constructive is better than active, and so on. And you can also predict equal performance and null results. Some people don't publish them, so those studies are not very abundant. That is, if you took interventions that are both active, then the results should be equivalent. But actually, what I'm also saying is that if you are designing intervention condition, you should design them in different within the same mode. Otherwise, you don't know whether you're comparing the modality difference, the mode difference, or your intervention, right? If you have both intervention, one active, one constructive, then you're really comparing modes. You're not comparing your intervention. So let me give you one example. This is a reason that I found out about it more recently. So this is an example of a study with very young children, age 5, by Christine Laguerre and Tanya Lombrazzo. So preschoolers, for example, were shown 5 interlocking gears. And there's a crank that turns, a fan, and there's also an irrelevant piece. We won't look at that. I mean, we won't focus on it. So all they do is ask the kid, say, watch, let's look at this for 40 seconds, and they turn the crank. In the second condition, they tell the kid, explain, tell me how this works, and they turn the crank for 40 seconds. In both cases, there's no feedback. So what is the learning measure? They wanted the child to be able to reconstruct the causal functional relationship between the crank and the gears to allow the machine to work. And a secondary measure is to exclude the irrelevant topper piece. So here's the results. This is the typical kind of results that is so clearly in support of ICAP. So if you just look at the red bar, because you can't see the gray bar, the red bar is the frequency of correct causal explanation. In this case, you look for correct causal explanation. It's much bigger, obviously, significantly bigger in the explaining group, which is to the right. This is the first graph on the left, than the watch observing group. And in the second thing, what she did was she looked at the students who actually gave explanations versus students who gave descriptions and compared describers versus explainers. And on the right hand side, the red bar for the learners is substantially higher. So both of these results support ICAP. And this is the kind of study we look at in the literature that is either, mostly a lot of them comes from the lab, and we reinterpret the results. Okay, so what we did was, we wanted to fill in the cell. I mean, we did fill in the cell in published work. I'll just show you a few examples. So you can't see the gray-blue background, but the equivalent ones, active versus active, means there's two. That first one on the left. Active versus active means that they're either doing knowledge telling or they're summarizing, and they're really both active, and therefore they got equivalent results. But let's look at some of the other ones. For example, if you're comparing constructive to passive, you're either building a concept map or reading a text. Well, of course, building concept maps better. We don't need to do that study anymore. Or peer tutoring is better than filling out guided notes, right? Because peer tutoring is interactive. Filling out guided notes is at best active. Or you can take notes collaboratively with a friend, or you can take notes alone, right? And then take notes collaborate with a friend is better than take notes alone. So this is the kind of thing I mean, the pairwise thing. Once in a while, rarely actually, you can find 3 modes of engagement in a single study. So Janice Goldberg's work show that reading is not as good as summarizing or describing, which is not as good as producing diagrams. And she has both 2 kinds of deep measures, and they both give you the same pattern. What happened here? Oh, you can't see the middle. The middle one is gray in between. So the 3 bars go stack, 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 stack. Okay, and we only did 1 study in our own lab to try to see whether our theory is prediction is accurate. And this is one where we try to manipulate all 4 modes in an engineering learning task, learning some engineering concept. So the 4 conditions are divided as such. 2 of them on the left only gets the text only condition. But what they do is they read this text, and then they get, so they either just read it, which is passive, or they read it and they're allowed to underline it, which is active. The second two conditions on the right is they're only given diagrams. They're not giving any text, right? And they're allowed to either explain, which is constructive, or explain jointly with a peer, which is interactive. Okay, what I want you to note is that in the text condition, what I've bracketed in the red is actually answer to the questions they need to, answers to questions they need to answer. Okay, so it's actually given to them. The answer is given to them. So what you find is that across the four modes, from read, underline, explain jointly, not only is there a significant pre-post difference, of course we expect that, but the difference across modes is significant. Okay, so this is what we mean by support for ICAP. Okay, now I want to go to the translation part. How do we translate a theory of student learning into a theory of instruction for teacher practices? Remember the key point I made earlier. The key point is that the same identical instruction can allow students to engage in any one of the four modes. But will they participate in the two higher modes? That's the question. Will students actually do the two higher modes? Well, obviously not, or else there wouldn't be this engagement problem out in the world. And also, Freeman et al.'s meta-analysis clearly show that they don't engage in these higher levels because lecturing was not effective. So even though we have this beautiful hypothesis, we can't be sure that teachers and students are doing it. So that's why we need this translation project. So this means that teachers need to elicit higher modes of student engagement. Can we actually teach teachers to do that? We try first by developing, our first attempt is developing an online ICAP module, and it has 3 lessons. Lesson 1 basically explained ICAP with lots of embedded questions. Lesson 2 had lots of exercise for them to upgrade or bump up activities, and what we mean by that is we might describe our activities, we say, how do you bump it up to this another mode? And then lesson 3 is we taught them how to design deep questions to assess lessons. Mainly because the constructive and active modes enhance deeper learning, we wanted them to be able to design those kind of questions. So this module was assigned as PD for all teachers in a charter school. 43 teachers completed it, but we were able to evaluate only 13 teachers who actually agreed to participate in the study that I'll talk about. So we'll call that the intervention study with these 13 teachers. So here's what we did. Each of the 13 teachers created 2 or 3 lessons. So on the left, you can see that's teacher 1. Teacher 1 created 3 lessons. Lesson 1, 2, 3 in the blue, okay? Each lesson is used in 2 what we call pair classes. That is, it's pair on the topic. So the blue has taught 2 classes in yellow and so on. So each lesson is taught by a pair class, and I'll explain what the pair class is. So each of the pair class is manipulated by what this manipulated by the teacher in terms of what they intend the modality, the mode of that class to be, and for both of them. Okay. So let's see if I said that right. Each of the pair classes are manipulated in the way the teacher wanted 2 classes. They could manipulate and have 1 interactive class, 1 active, whatever they choose. It's all up to them. And they receive minimal feedback on their design, and then they taught the classes as designed. So essentially, what we're doing is the teacher is a researcher, right? Teacher is designing their own quasi-experiments. So this part's clear, right? Okay. So here's just an example. A teacher designed a worksheet. On the left is what we call an active worksheet because all the students do is card sorting, which is, very common, this kind of thing, very popular kind of design. On the right is interactive. That is, they didn't give them things to sort, but they asked them to generate the responses and generate it with a friend. So this is what I mean. This would be a pair class where these 2 activities are what we call the unique activities, that is, activities that differentiate the 2 classes. Okay? All right. Now we're going to go to the results. We're going to report 8 results, actually 8 results, and we have 5 comprehensive and longitudinal measures in terms from teachers' learning to students' learning. So first, we're going to measure teachers' learning of ICAP. We're going to look at teachers' design of lesson plans. We're going to look at their implementation in classroom. We'll look at students' enactment, and then we're going to look at students' learning. So those are 5 phases of analysis we're going to do, resulting in 8 results that we're going to talk about. So the first result is teachers learning of ICAP module. Well, clearly they learn something. I mean, they spend 2 or 3 hours on this module. They learn something, and the learning significant from pre to post and dark to red. However, if you look at the difficult questions or the more discriminating questions, they only really basically learn about 60% best, right? So we need to improve that. We didn't do a good enough job, but they did learn some. The second more important, interesting question is, how did the teachers, how did they do it actually transferring what they've learned to design of activities? That is, activities that upgraded from one mode to the other. So the teachers designed a total of 65 lessons, contain a total of 105 unique activities. So these unique activities are different between their classes, as I said, and there's 29 active, 29 constructive, but no, 47 interactive activities, so they design a lot of these. So the majority of them are interactive, which is important to note. The real question is, with this variability, how do we evaluate their design activities? There's different domains, some in English language or field, like literature, some in physics, some in chemistry. It was very difficult. So what we decided to do is that there's actually one common source of data across all the worksheets. And we call this the instructional directives. That is, what is the instruction teacher gave students as they explain what they have to do with this task? So that's common across them, and that's common across 88 worksheets. So we're going to evaluate those. We segment and code the directives in terms of the verb phrases. So, for example, if you say connect two ideas, that's a constructive mode, or connect two nodes, that could be active. So we do use context for coding. However, even without context, we can more or less determine the mode of a verb. And the distribution on the right, I know you can't read it, so it shows that the 58 number, that's the number of active verbs that teachers use. So they use twice as many active verbs as the bar next to it, which is constructive verbs, 28. I'll show you again in a minute. And there's actually few interactive verbs, which is 9, and there's 10 vague verbs we could interpret, and 6 passive verbs. So let's go through this a little bit. So out of a sample of 111 verbs, within our sample of 13 teachers, 58, about half of them, were manipulative or active verbs. So teachers were obviously very familiar with them. So things like label a triangle, measure this compound, name this, confirm this, consider this. Okay, all these words, I think you might agree, are actually manipulative verbs in the sense that they don't add any new information to the materials. But only 27 verbs are generative verbs, like ask a question, brainstorm, draw, explain, justify, and you can see all those. For example, use information on your team gathered yesterday to generate a racial chart. Using the supplies provided, create a model protein. So these will be generative tasks. They use very few collaborative or interactive verbs. There are only 9 of them, which is 8%, and none emphasize co-generation. So, but remember, they designed 47 interactive tasks, right? So if they didn't even use any co-generation verbs, then we can't expect those classes to have done correctly, to be implemented correctly. So the verbs they've used were things like agreed upon, answer with a partner, debate, discuss, exchange, help, participate, share, and work with a partner. And they usually say it in the context, right? This is just how we coded this, separate words. So the teacher's few variety of interactive verbs were just vague terms, as I said before, and such as discuss. So whose fault was it that they used such vague verbs? Turns out it was actually our fault. So we just went back recently, we looked at the module, we identified, isolated all the interactive verbs we taught them, right, in the module. And there was 20 instances of them. And as you see in this table, it's very much like what they said. So there were only one instance, you might say, the last one, where it could be a co-constructive kind of instruction. So we failed in the module itself. So the lesson learned is that the verbs we use are very similar to the verbs they use, and we failed to explain what to build and extend each other's contribution meant. And we only demonstrated once. So because of our instructional failure, the rest of the data, we're gonna ignore how students perform for interactive classes because they're really not accurate. Since then, we've done some analysis of analyzing dialogue patterns using ICAP modes. And you can see, I'll go through this just quickly. We can see that there's usually actually many patterns of dialogue pattern, and only one of them is co-constructive. So for example, the first one is when there's no arrow in the thing, that P and P means the two person are just sitting there, they're not really interacting. No arrows means they're not interacting. A and A means they're not really interacting, they're each manipulating their own thing. You could be C and C too, you're not interacting. But of course C and C means you're constructive, so that's already pretty good. The C and C is pretty good. You could also be active and interacting. For example, you can pass a mouse back and forth to each other. That's active, and you are interacting, right? And then the third quadrant, the third one down lower right, one partner could be dominating, and there's several patterns of that too. That is, one person can be constructive, the other person active, and so on. You can see the permutation. Obviously, the person who's constructive will learn, but not the person who's active. And we have data from this back in about 10 years ago. One of my graduate students collected that data. And finally, in the fourth condition, is the actual co-constructive condition. So you can see only 20% at best of the time when you get appropriate co-constructive dialogue pattern. So it's a very difficult thing to achieve. So next question to ask is, were the teachers accurate for the active and constructive classes that they designed? That is, so we know teachers are biased in using more manipulative verbs, but were they actually accurate? So accuracy here means that did they design their appropriate activities for a class they had intended to be a specific ICAP mode? That is, does the verb match the mode of the class that they intended as they designed? So we use mode of the class as a criterion here to assess their accuracy, because the teacher's process assessment is for that class. Okay, so what this graph shows is the verbs in the written directives for each intended class. So on the x-axis shows the active, the constructive, and interactive classes as they designed them, the teachers designed them. So what you expect if you were in an active class, and if the teacher intended to be active class, most of the things you design should have a manipulative aspect to it, which will be the blue bar, right? In this case, the blue bar. And you would expect it to be 100%, so you can see what the dotted line, what it should be. But if the class was intended to be constructive, then you want the red bar, that is generative activities, to be the maximum. You expect that to be 100%, and so forth for interactive. So this is an easy way for you to see how far off they are. So they're clearly better in active classes and clearly worse in an interactive class. Okay, now how about transfer to design of assessment questions? This is really tough. Teachers had a hard time understanding how to design inference questions. So we asked them to design both recall and inference type questions, just, as I said, because ICAP's prediction is only true for those two higher modes, if the two higher modes were included. But they were scaffolded with 12 sentence openers or sentence stems. This was taken directly from King, 1992. So they were scaffolded how to design it. So what we want to see here is the type of question the teachers designed, the left column, 97 recall questions, 69 inference questions, compared to the researchers' judgment of whether a question was recall or inference. You can see by what I bolded that they were pretty accurate, right? 87% of the recall question was the researchers agree is a recall question, and 72% of inference questions they agree was inference questions. So the third result we want to talk about is teachers' transfer of the learning to implementation. This is really tough. So what do? The pattern of verbs and oral directives were transcribed from the videos. I mean, we try a lot of things. Okay, I'm just going to report on this. So we want to compare it with the teacher's intended mode for that class. As before, instead of verbal, now we're looking oral. So we basically get the exact same pattern results, except more depressed, right? The oral was worse in each mode. Most accurate was again active, and least accurate was an interactive. And in fact, the interactive words down to almost a minimal, 2%. So what about implementation fidelity of these assessment questions? And I'll tell you what happens. So what we did last time was the researcher decided whether a recall question was recall, whether an inference question was inference. This time, when we look on the video, we found that what happened was a lot of the time they give away the answers that was in the assessment. So what they had designed as inference question became recall questions, right? So out of the 69 inference questions, 75% of it became recall questions because they gave away the answers. So we call this they converted ask to tell. That's just a shorthand for what I'm talking about here. So, as I just said, a simple way to think about it is that teachers tell instead of ask. And one reason why teachers were more accurate in the original design when they designed it according to researchers' analysis, because they were scaffolded with the STEM questions. When they're not scaffolded, this is what happens. What happened to my water? Water. Okay, no water. Okay. The fourth thing is, what happened to my bottle? Oh, well. The fourth thing is student enactment. That is, did the students actually enact the activities in the mode intended by the class? So overall, did they do it in those response sheets and questions or problems? We coded 754 responses that was embedded in 65 active, constructive, interactive worksheets, or classes, let's say. And then we'll see in a minute that we cannot really code for code generation, right? And I'll show you in a second, because we don't know who generated this class in context. So we could only code for manipulative or generative, and I'll show one example. And then we compare the mode of the questions and the mode of the responses. Thank you. So here's an example. So this is active student enactment segments. There's 11 segments highlighted, and you can't see it on the left, but whatever they generated on the left is pretty identical to what's on the right. So that's a manipulative response. You can't see the original, but we indicate these are new ideas that they generated. So from this graph or output, we could decide that it was constructive. Now for interactive, this is what I mean. We could code the products to show that there's generation, right? There's constructive generation, but we can't tell whether it was interactively produced. One person could have copied from the others. So we haven't figured out how to do this yet. We can't really code the products for code construction. So how did the student enact the 65 worksheet activities embedded in these three kinds of classes? This is really interesting finding here. And note, across these classes, this is just an overall performance, student enacted predominantly manipulatively across all classes, regardless of what kind of classes it was. So the blue lines show how they enacted almost 90% in each class. They only produce manipulative ideas. So although they did generate a little bit more constructive activity, generative ideas than the other kind. So that difference is significant, but still predominantly. Oh, thank you so much. Okay. So these results shows that students were enacting largely in the active mode across all classes. That's not what we want. But our comparisons were very gross. That is, it was measured against the class that teacher intended. The worksheet for each class tend to have mixed modes, right? So you take a worksheet, and some of them are constructive questions, some of them are active questions. So they're not faithful to what they intended to be. That's not surprising. So but what we really want to do is dissociate the inaccuracies of teachers' directives from the students' enactment, right? We want to dissociate the two. That is, we coded the individual question within each worksheet to see if it's an active constructive question. So we picked out individual questions within a worksheet and made a decision, regardless of what the teacher intended, whether the question was constructive or active. Then we look at the students' responses to individual worksheet questions by the mode that we coded it. Get that? So it's very specific now, very sensitive measure. Now we ask, if that was the case, are students more likely to enact generatively if the question explicitly requested a generative response, and so, or actively? So this is a much more sensitive measure than determining accuracy. So here's what we found. Students were significantly more likely to answer generatively, 42%, when a constructive question was asked versus an active question. It's 5% versus 42%. So they do respond constructively or generatively if you explicitly elicit them. So this is very promising, right? This means we have to try even harder to make sure teachers know how to elicit these responses. But this result is very promising. So what about learning outcome? So how does enactment translate to learning? We have to pool all the classes of the same mode because there's just too much variability within each teacher's lesson to make the comparison as I had hoped. I thought it was going to be like lab study. Oh, well, let's compare those. But this is authentic classroom, so you can't do that. So we pull all the data, we ignore the passive classes because there's just like 2 or 3 of them, and ignore the interactive classes because we didn't teach them how to actually give interactive instruction. So pulling our class, we did find significant differences for the constructive classes versus the active classes based on the teacher's intended mode. So this is very promising. That means we could keep on refining and get even more performance in both the teachers and the student. So let me summarize the main findings and the lessons we've learned, showing where there's a lot of room for improvement. First, teacher had the weakest understanding of collaborative or interactive abilities based on their verb usage. And to add to that, we have the least understanding about collaborative, interactive activities. And since then, we've understood it much better. So we need to improve on that. Teachers also lean heavily toward giving active directives, right? They need to be designing much more for constructive activities, especially important because we're postulating that there's a huge gap in learning between active and constructive. The third thing is that from the design of inference questions to implementation, they had what I call slippage. That is, they slip from asking to telling, and that's something we have to figure out how to correct. And students also responded predominantly manipulatively, so they did not enact as directed by some of the higher mode directives. And we haven't thought about how to do that yet. However, for explicit constructive questions that did respond generatively 42% of the times. So we need teachers to design more questions that elicit explicitly generative responses. This tendency, even though it's modest, was sufficient to produce significant learning benefits for constructive over active classes. So the goal of our current work, this work continues, in revising our module from the lessons we've learned. So the real big question is, can teachers learn to elicit more generative and collaborative responses from students, especially during implementation? So we're going to focus a lot more on implementation. So what do we learn from this 5 to 8 years of comprehensive translation project? It's 8 years if you think about the theory development part as well. So it's a very long and big, huge project. So it's very effortful, right, as you can imagine. It's a longitudinal study. It takes years. You need a lot of patience. And in fact, we're now back to the drawing board, right? We have to go back and iterate now with new questions from what we've learned. And it can only be carried out with generous support from funders like the IES. And this work, of course, cannot be done without contributions for multiple lab members. And these are 12 lab members who have helped me, and some of them have moved on to much better things now. But anyway, they've helped a lot. So thank you for your attention, and wonder if you took notes. I can take questions, obviously. You have time.
Please, feel free. I was just
Okay.
you know,
Stella.
Well, thank you, Micki, for a very interesting stuff. I was wondering whether you're being too severe with yourself when you rate your constructive mode by looking only at constructive verbs. One of the things is want your students to discuss or to share, you know, maybe in the process you need to give them some instructions about how to do that.
Oh, yeah.
So when you are going to tell them about how to discuss, you're going to use active verbs rather than constructive verbs. So I was wondering, you probably have considered that.
Yeah.
And it was a question in my mind, how you dealt with it.
Well, so one of the biggest problem is that we're going to have to figure out how to teach teachers how to teach students how to collaborate in this co-constructive way. That's a huge problem. The only person who has worked on it a little bit is Noreen Webb and Megan Franke. So that is where we're going to really focus a large chunk of attention, and thinking about all the ways that you're talking about, using maybe some technology to help, and I'm going to go to CSCL and see what they found out so far. And yeah, that is the big problem. Yeah, we did not do enough training at all for them.
Yeah, but what my question is that if you are in a classroom and you want your students to discuss, and then you tell them some things about how they can be more productive in discussing, then you're using active verbs. You're not using constructive verbs. So in the context of trying to get your students to be constructive, you also use active verbs. So how do you account for that? And these active verbs may be appropriate within the constructive context. I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
So you're saying that when we give them instruction how to interact, we also gave them active verbs?
Well, if you want to tell them how to,
Yeah.
then your verbs are going to be active.
Well, to be interactive, they first have to be, each of them have to be constructive, right? So they have to be constructive, not just, the only difference is that they have to instruct not just by making inferences or build on your own, but you also have to build on the others. So in all cases, they need to be building, whether on own or on the other. So I'm sure it includes some active activities as well, but I don't know about the verbs. I mean, I don't think we shouldn't use active verbs, manipulative verbs, because then we can't get them to construct in the first place. I know, I can talk to you offline. Okay. Hi,
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Wow. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little more about the training module for the teachers. And I was wondering if you thought about using the ICAP framework to teach the ICAP framework.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Everybody tells, that's very obvious. Okay. The next thing, we can't do in this grant, I mean, we're all actually on the second grant, but for the third grant, we're going to make it an adaptive and intelligent tutoring system. That's the hope, if we get funded. We'll see.
Going on here. Mike's going around.
I was wondering, to what extent do you refer to the ICAP model as a model that describes like modes of engagement, that's more descriptive of what students are doing? And to what extent do you use it as a taxonomy of for designing tasks? It seems that you're using it interchangeably, or is it both?
We use it in all ways. So the other thing we use ICAP for, which has turned out to be really, really productive, we use it as coding device. So you can use ICAP to code anything, right, you want, and you can figure out what's going on. So we use it in all ways. To see how teachers are designing, how students are enacting, so on.
Because I can use very interactive verbs as a teacher and give them wonderful instructions, which we have done. And then that doesn't mean that the students will do it. So you can tell them, you should argue and refer to each other and transact, and they won't. So, is it more like a prescriptive model for teachers how to use it, or are we using it as a way to, how do we know that they really qualitatively do what they're supposed to be doing? Because some of these studies that are in this matrix, I would guess, looked at what students were doing, and then others were looking at only the surface features of the tasks, I would gather, right, in your meta-analysis.
For most of the lab studies that I cited, right, we're only looking at whatever outcomes they have. And some of these outcome measures are not necessarily learning. It could be some kind of performance, like can a kid find can a kid find on a map, you know, where something is located, if they explain the map or they're thinking about it or not, you know, one of Lynn Libben's work was like that. So, you know, that kind of work also. So we don't have anything but the outcome measures for the published studies to look at. So what you said is exactly similar to what we found, right? You could be instructing them about how to interact or how to be constructive, but then they enact it mostly actively. So the problem is to trying to understand what is it about the instruction that's faulty, that they're not getting it. So to teach them how to interact, it's not sufficient just to explain to them, oh, you build on each other. So that's not sufficient. We have to actually show them how to do it, maybe, and obviously to model and everything. So that's a shortcoming that, you know, we have to deal with our instruction.
Clearly, you've clearly created what is a pretty hierarchical taxonomy. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about what are some of the dangers with using something like that with teachers in terms of how they respond to that. Sometimes that can cause teachers a lot of anxiety when they feel like they're either not achieving it or they don't understand necessarily that even though some certain ways of approaching things may be better, that doesn't mean that you should just throw out all of your sort of lower level pieces of the taxonomy and so forth.
Yeah, we haven't really dealt with that kind of issues, but the main confusion that teachers might get is they confuse this ICAP framework with Bloom's taxonomy. So that's a very serious problem that we haven't quite figured out how to address completely yet. But our ICAP is on the input side. That is, what do kids and teachers have to do for them to learn? Whereas Bloom is more on the output side. I mean, that's a simple dichotomy of the two. So yes, we have to figure out how to explain that.
It seems like the interactive, the highest level is you have to have two people that both act constructive. Mm-hmm. But in a lot of times in the classroom, we have maybe a group of 4, a group of 6 children together. Yeah. And how do you differentiate between a group like 3 children are really engaged and elaborate and doing this exchange of ideas, and the other group of all children are contributing equally. So to what extent do you have a plan to extend this individual engagement measure to group level engagement measure?
So you're saying, should I develop methods where I can actually measure how interactive people are as a group, right? As a group, rather than, so the long and short of it is that, no, we haven't gotten to groups more than 2. It's just we're having enough complications of trying to figure out 2. We can't go to 3 yet.
I guess the other way to ask the question is, if you are in a group with children who you may not necessarily asking questions or asking for clarification, but you hear your peers do that. And we know that observations is a really important way to internalize. So just to what extent would you see these shy kids who never talk but internalize this way of asking for clarification is also reaching that interactive engagement mode?
Right. So it's obvious that people who simply observe and listen to other people can also learn. We actually have a paper that just came out at JLS that looks at how students learn from watching other people interact. In fact, these are watching videos of how people interact. So kids clearly learn, okay? But in that study, that was contrasting how well they learn from observing videos versus observing videos of dialogue, tutorial dialogue actually, versus observing monologue by the same instructors. But the answer to your question is yes. as I said earlier, there is not a perfect 100% alignment between what they're thinking and what they're actually doing. I'm just saying, overall, on average in a classroom, or on average per person, let's say you're reading for an hour. If you're not taking notes in that hour, chances are you slipped into a passive a lot of times. And in a class, if everybody's just paying attention, nobody's taking notes, on average, that's a passive class. So the same thing applies for a group of 6 people. If there's 3 people are just watching, some of them could be thinking deeply. Just like you all are thinking deeply.
I have a question here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can I go ahead? So thank you so much. I did have a question about the interactive level. Have you thought at all about trying to further differentiate within that interactive level even more fine-grained, so that you would have less interactivity versus greater interactivity in terms of dialogue?
Yeah, so you mean by those, the patterns of interaction that we've identified?
Exactly.
It's easy to identify them, right? When we do, I don't have it here, but I did have, we are developing new methods of coding dialogue. In fact, a lot of it is in that new JLS paper. We're trying new ways to analyze dialogue, and we do use ICAP to analyze them. And once you analyze them, you can see these different patterns, right? But we didn't do a systematic calculation of which pattern is more prominent, but just looking at the probability of these patterns, you can see that the actual co-constructive types are very rare. I mean, frequency-wise, could be very rare. So they're going to be hard to achieve in instruction.
Within the interactive level, can you have even further differentiation of higher cognitive processes through overt behavior?
Higher cognitive processes.
So is there anything higher than the interactive level?
I haven't thought about what
Okay.
else could be higher. I don't know. No, you mean in a classroom context?
Yeah, so it's something, let's say, that would show greater critical thinking that's generated by both
okay.
parties as they interact together.
Okay, what I haven't, this theory does not incorporate the idea of feedback, right? So I'm sure, for example, as a teacher-led discussion, do you learn more from that? Well, there's a lot of work done on that, but you need to know how to train teachers to lead constructive kind of responses from the students, right? So with a teacher-led discussion, the difference is that there's a feedback component. So we didn't look at, so it's possible if you add that component, you get a lot, you could be exceeding interactive.
Thank you.
Interactive was pretty powerful.
The four modes seems still very general. Do you think there are different levels within each mode, or do you think it's desirable to further differentiate the different levels?
Yes, that's a good question. Okay, so here's what I'm saying. I'm saying based on the behaviors, we can differentiate 4 modes. But within a mode, you can differentiate the value of a task, but then you have to do something a little bit more deep. You have to analyze the cognitive processes, right? So, and there's affordances of tasks and everything. So let me give you one example. Suppose you want to compare, is it better to construct a diagram, or is it better to give explanation, like self-explanations? They're both constructive tasks. Is one better than the other? Well, it's possible one's better, right? You got to analyze it. For example, diagrams have certain affordances, and based on those affordances, you will learn, you can get more out of a diagram because you see, oh, that's a lateral triangle or equilateral triangle, which you didn't notice till you actually drew it. So diagram has a lot of affordances, and diagrams also very sparse, so that you can forces you to make a lot of inferences. That's a constructive task. Explaining, on the other hand, is very dense. What I like about explaining, I like diagrams too. What I like about the benefit of explaining is they're very dense. You can generate a lot of minor, small inferences quickly, and cumulatively is very effective, right? So I cannot compare those two kinds of tasks unless I do in-depth laboratory studies where I understand what the content processes are. So this is for a classroom context where you cannot expect a teacher to infer what are the content processes students are doing. So we're basing it on the physical behavior outputs. What else? Yeah. All right, then I better walk over here.
Okay, so here. Yeah, so thank you. Here is, I have a question is, do teacher has any strategies when in the classroom setting students, for example, it's actually an interactive class, but students are doing active behaviors. So how they will prompt students to transfer from that active behavior to interactive behaviors? Will they do this kind of?
You mean when the kids are actually collaborating? I mean, working together?
Yeah, as teacher, they suspect it's actually an interactive class, but students are not doing interactive things. As you show in the before table, students in their worksheet, they maybe they don't show too much collaboration. So how teachers will try to change their behavior during the process in the classroom?
Okay, so there's two problems in the scenario you posed. Problem one is how well can teachers detect it on the fly?
Yeah.
So we haven't explored that. Can they actually detect it? And secondly, once they detect it, what are they going to do? What are they going to tell them to do? Again, that's something we still have to work on. But other people are working on things like that as well. I know Kurt's working on that using technology to detect whether somebody's actually collaborating or not.
Yeah,
so there are multiple ways, and we haven't actually approached the two problems.
Yeah, because as you mentioned there, you're using verbs to detect if it is a kind of interactive questions, or like maybe we can use the same technology to detect students' answers as well, using verbs and like using AI agents to give them instant feedback.
Yeah, we can do that. But remember, the verb thing is a very new thing, and we're using it as a way to analyze the data. We're not sure yet. I mean, we actually don't know whether using the verbs to teach them might be completely helpful. I mean, I'm imagining it would be if we give them a list of verbs. And the other thing we found out is that when you scaffold teachers can do a lot of things, like designing the right questions. But the problem is when you take away the scaffold, then they might falter. Granted that we didn't give them enough instruction to perhaps fade the scaffolding, right? We didn't do any of that stuff yet. This is our first attempt. Our second attempt is coming up in the next year. So if you have any ideas, tell us.
Please.
Question is, when you talk about verbs, I start thinking about the role of the content being taught and the prior knowledge of the learners. So I want to know a little bit about how you are looking at that.
Well, the verb analysis is only done in the context of the directives, right? So, you know, the directives are, I gave an example, why don't you guys think about or identify what you think is important. So identify would be a verb, or explain what you think is important. So these words are pretty content generic. I mean, they're pretty generic. They could be applied to various content, but our interpretation, to be completely accurate, we try to interpret the phrase, right? So that's not the same content as the domain content, I think. It should be applicable to all. At least we used it to analyze all domains.
No, I think maybe later on you might see some content differences that could be helpful for intervention.
Okay. Oh. Well, a lot of the, so we have 65 lessons, and a lot of the topics are, we actually discover maybe about 11 or 15, I don't remember, of the lessons were not in these rich content. So they don't really need ICAP. So remember I said some content you don't need the higher modes. If you were learning grammar, rules of grammar, you just have to learn them. So we parsed out those, and we still got pretty much the same pattern results.
So how much do you take student agency into account in terms of designing the nature of activities themselves? For example, in project-based learning, the interactivity and construction generativity will be way better compared to more teacher-generated activities.
So student agency, meaning that whether a student is motivated to try harder and do a constructive task?
We work in data literacy using visual representations. So students come up with a topic they are going to work on.
Yeah.
They work in pairs or individually, and they look for data, construct visual representations, what we call infographics, for a lack of a better term. So in that case, the interactivity, the constructive generative process will be way better, I expect, compared to teacher-designed tasks.
Oh, you mean, you want me to compare whether it's more advantageous for a student to be constructive generative versus what a teacher dictates that they should do? Is that what you mean? Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, that's all possible. Remember the first time I showed the slide where if you lecture, a student can do anything and they'll improve, depends on what they do. And that's true of all of us, right? We go to lectures all the time, but we're really thinking deeply, right? So you're saying, suppose a teacher did not give you the right task, dictate the right mode. Could students do it? And yeah, they could if they're motivated to do that. Motivation comes in, I know, so yeah. More?
Hello. My question is, so is there any strange case in your study? For example, the class in the interactive mode, but the learning result is not that good. Because I'm thinking, if there are any condition for any mode for the student can learn very well between if we so the general the result is that there's a sound try to make our class more interactive. So generally it is a good choice for the teachers, but is there any condition for this mode to be really successful? Because if there's maybe the condition is good to know.
So you're asking, are there conditions in which interactive classes could be better or worse?
Yeah.
I haven't thought about that. I don't think. No. I mean, other than the fact that we're not giving them the right instruction and they're not implementing it. No, I haven't thought about that.
So is there any, in the passive class, so the learning result is really good. So sometimes the learning result may depend on the teacher quality,
Oh, I'm sure there's lots and lots of variables that affect whether some classes turn out good or not, right? But that's tangential to what I'm talking about. So are you saying that maybe some classes are so good, even in the passive mode, that we don't need the interactive mode? Is that what you're saying?
No, but what I'm saying is, sometimes we want to, the mode, there's 4 different mode, and in generally, teacher may have a try to make their classroom to more interactive, to be the student more actively engaged in the classroom. But so whether student learning occur in their classroom, so is there any the critical condition for student learning to occur in one classroom? And maybe, for example, the teacher must know the students' learning needs and try to meet the various learning needs. If they can, ask, provide a good task or provide a good question to not just the mode, you know,
Right.
to the surface,
So are you saying that there are maybe individual differences? I like to rephrase people's questions. Are you saying there's individual differences in class? Yeah, there's always individual differences in the classroom, right? And how do we, I haven't thought about how we tailor to individual differences. That's a short answer.
Probably, I'm not sure, okay. My interpretation to his question is,
Oh, say that again, start.
my interpretation to
Yeah.
his question
Yes.
is that, like, suppose you found a classroom, it's very interactive, students were very interactive engagement.
In the
but-
correct, optimum way.
Yeah, but when you do kind of test or something like that to measure students' learning, and you found that this group or this class of students didn't learn anything.
Oh.
Is that possible?
You mean, of course. You mean the results didn't predict my theory? Can't imagine. No. Of course that's possible. I can't explain that. I mean, of course that's possible. Anything's possible. Okay.
For my own question is that I noticed that most of the work you've done were like you have the student, or you have the teachers to do some kind of thing, and then to see whether the classroom, the class activity, or the whole class is passive or interactive or something like that. So my question is like whether I can do a research in a reverse mode. Like, for example, I compared two classrooms and found one class, like the students engaged in those two high-level engagement a lot than the other classroom. Can I see that the teacher A for the better class is a better teacher than the other teacher who taught the other class in terms of their pedagogical skills or something like that?
Yeah, I probably don't want to say whether a teacher is better teacher or worse. I think you could answer that question by looking at maybe their artifacts, right, the activities they created, to see whether their activities are actually better. You can probably make some inferences there.
Couple more minutes. Is there a final question? Maybe one more.
I just had one other question about the, looking at the dialogue patterns. You had mentioned that you haven't yet looked beyond groups of 2. Do you have any thoughts about how we might do that, though, if we have triads or groups of 4 or 5, for instance?
Well, I mean, I think the instruction for triads probably wouldn't be that different from instruction for dyads.
Mm-hmm.
I know of all the other methods that people have tried, Carol's method, assigning roles and a lot of different methods. And I think we're going to see if we can try something different.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, and then we'll see. I mean, we just don't know right now what the result might be.
And then the
But-
last question,
yeah.
have you applied this ever in workplace learning settings?
No, but someone else has. I came across a paper about, I don't remember which one it is, but someone else has. They've applied ICAP in workplace learning, and it's a published paper.
Okay.
I just can't remember the name right now.
Thank you.
Do you? I'm asking my student.
Final questions for
Yeah.
Micki? Final questions for Micki? Great, I think we have got a couple minutes. There's a time for some informal. Maybe we should just give her a round of applause and thank her tremendously.
Thank you.